The metal walls of Station Nexus hummed with quiet energy as beings from across the galaxy moved through its corridors. Commander Jake Morrison walked beside his team of 11 other humans, their boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. They had traveled far from Earth to reach this place, a massive structure that orbited the neutral moon of Kepler 442c. This was where different alien species came together to learn and share knowledge. Jake looked at his people as they walked. Dr. Lisa Carter carried her translation device, ready to help with any language problems. Pete Johnson had his engineering tools, always prepared to fix something or figure out how things worked. Dr. Helen Brooks held her mathematical charts and papers, her mind already working on the challenges ahead. The other 9 humans in their group were equally skilled in their own fields. They were here for one important reason. The Galactic Education Consortium wanted to test human intelligence before allowing Earth to join their group. For months, they had taken test after test, solving problems that other species found difficult. Each time, the humans had done well. Sometimes too well for the comfort of their alien observers. Professor Zixthara waited for them in the main testing chamber. The Vorthan being stood 7 feet tall, its body made of what looked like living crystal that changed colors based on its mood. Right now, the crystal showed deep purple, which Jake had learned meant the professor was annoyed or frustrated. Around the chamber, other alien species watched from behind protective barriers. The tentacled Morphians moved their arms in complex patterns as they spoke to each other. The gaseous ethereals floated in their containment suits, their forms shifting. Like clouds? "Welcome back, humans," Professor Zixthara said, its voice sounding like wind chimes in a storm. "You have completed our standard evaluations with results that were unexpected." Jake nodded politely. "We're grateful for the opportunity, Professor." The crystal being's color shifted to a darker purple. "Perhaps too grateful. Your species has performed better than predicted. Some of my colleagues believe this suggests your tests were somehow compromised." Dr. Lisa Carter stepped forward, her translation device ready. "We can assure you that we completed all tests honestly, Professor." "Yes, I believe you did," Zixthara replied. "Which is why today's evaluation will be different. Today you face a challenge that has tested the greatest minds of the Vorthan Empire for over 3,000 years. The professor gestured with one crystalline arm toward a large display screen. On it appeared a grid, 9 squares by 9 squares, filled with various symbols. There were crescents, triangles, spirals, diamonds, stars, circles, squares, crosses, and dots. Some spaces in the grid were empty, waiting to be filled. "This is the Great Logic Matrix," Professor Zixthara announced, its crystal form now glowing with pride. "It represents the pinnacle of logical reasoning in our civilization. The rules are complex but clear. Each row must contain all 9 symbols. Exactly once. Each column must contain all 9 symbols exactly once. Each of the 9 smaller 3x3 grids within the larger grid must also contain all 9 symbols exactly once." The humans looked at the display with interest. Pete Johnson tilted his head slightly as he studied the pattern. Dr. Helen Brooks pulled out a small notebook and began writing down the rules as the professor explained them. "Many of our greatest scholars have spent entire lifetimes attempting to solve just one such matrix," the professor continued. "Some have solved perhaps 2 or 3 in their careers. A few exceptional individuals have managed 5 or 6. No Vorthan has ever solved more than 8 of these puzzles." Jake Morrison watched as his team members exchanged quick glances. Something was happening, but he could not tell what it was yet. Professor Zixthara's crystal body brightened with confidence. "I have prepared 12 of these matrices for your group. If you can solve even 3 of them, your species will have proven intellectual capability beyond question. If you solve 6, you will have matched our greatest minds. If you somehow manage more than 8, you will have achieved something no Vorthan has accomplished." The other alien observers leaned forward with interest. This was clearly a moment they had been waiting for. The Morphians' tentacles moved faster and the ethereals' forms swirled with anticipation. "However," the professor added, its tone becoming more serious, If you fail to solve at least one matrix completely, your species will be deemed intellectually insufficient for consortium membership. You will return to your homeworld and may not reapply for 50 Earth years. The weight of this challenge settled over the chamber. Jake felt the responsibility for his entire species resting on their shoulders. One puzzle solved meant they could try again later. No puzzles solved meant humanity would be locked out of galactic civilization for decades. We understand the stakes. Professor, Jake said firmly, how much time do we have? You have 4 hours, Zixtara replied. That should be sufficient time to attempt the puzzles, though I do not expect you to complete many, if any at all. The professor's crystal form shifted to a lighter color, almost transparent. This indicated amusement Jake had learned. The alien clearly expected the humans to fail spectacularly. You may use any tools you brought with you, the professor added. Paper, writing instruments, computing devices. Collaboration is permitted. Begin when you are ready. The 12 matrices appeared on individual screens around the chamber. Each human could choose which puzzle to attempt, or they could work together on the same ones. The alien observers settled in to watch what they expected to be a long, frustrating process ending in human defeat. Jake looked at his team again. Dr. Helen Brooks was staring at the first matrix with an expression he had never seen before. Pete. Johnson was looking at the second puzzle, and his mouth was starting to curve upward slightly. Dr. Lisa Carter had moved to the third matrix and was covering her mouth with her hand. Something was definitely happening, and Jake was beginning to suspect it was not what Professor Zixtara expected. The fate of humanity's place in the galaxy was about to be decided, but his people did not look worried or confused. Instead, they looked like they were trying very hard not to smile. The challenge had begun, and Jake Morrison had the strangest feeling that the Galactic Education Consortium was about to learn something very surprising about human intelligence. Dr. Helen Brooks stared at the glowing screen in front of her for exactly 3 seconds. Her eyes moved across the 9x9 grid, taking in the symbols and empty spaces. The crescents were placed here and there, the triangles scattered in what seemed like random positions, the spirals forming no obvious pattern. But Helen's brain was already working, already seeing something that made her heart race with excitement. She turned to look at Pete Johnson, who was studying the second matrix. Their eyes met across the chamber, and Pete's expression told her everything she needed to know. He had seen it too. The thing that Professor Zixtara and the entire Galactic Education Consortium had somehow missed. Pete's shoulders started to shake slightly as he fought to control his reaction. He looked away from Helen quickly, focusing back on his screen. But she could see him biting his lower lip to keep from smiling too widely. Dr. Lisa Carter had moved to the third puzzle display. As the team's linguist, she was always good at recognizing patterns, whether in languages or symbols. When she saw the matrix, her hand flew up to cover her mouth. Her eyes grew wide, and she looked around the chamber as if checking to make sure. She was not dreaming. The other 9 humans began to gather around the various displays. Each person who looked at a matrix had the same reaction. First, a moment of careful study. Then recognition. Then the struggle to maintain diplomatic composure. In front of their alien observers, Commander Jake Morrison noticed the change in his team immediately. These were people he had worked with for years. He knew their expressions, their body language, their reactions to different situations. Right now, they all looked like children who had just been told they could have ice cream for dinner. Is there a problem? Professor Zixtara asked, its crystal form shifting to a curious green color. Do you need the rules explained again? Helen Brooks cleared her throat carefully. Professor, could you please clarify the rules one more time? I want to make sure we understand completely. The crystal being's form brightened with what Jake recognized as pleasure. Clearly, the professor enjoyed explaining the complexity of Vorthan intellectual achievement. Of course, Zixtara said, moving to stand beside the first matrix. Each horizontal row must contain all 9 symbols, the crescent, triangle, spiral, diamond, star, circle, square, cross, and dot exactly once. No symbol may appear twice. In the same row. Pete Johnson nodded seriously, though Jake could see his teammates' hands trembling slightly with suppressed amusement. Each vertical column must also contain all 9 symbols exactly once, the professor continued. Again, no repetition is allowed. Lisa Carter made a small sound that might have been a cough or might have been a choked laugh. She turned it into a polite clearing of her throat. Finally, and most importantly, Professor Zixthar went on. Its crystal form now glowing with pride, the grid is divided into 9 smaller 3x3 squares. Each of these smaller squares must also contain all 9 symbols exactly once. The professor gestured grandly at the display. These 3 rules create a puzzle of extraordinary complexity. The interaction between row, column, and square requirements demands logical thinking of the highest order. It requires the solver to consider multiple variables simultaneously while maintaining perfect accuracy across all constraints. Helen Brooks looked around at her teammates. Every single human in the chamber was now struggling to maintain a straight face. The situation had moved beyond amusing into something approaching surreal. The symbols themselves have deep cultural significance to the Vorthan people, the professor added. The crescent represents time, the triangle represents stability, the spiral represents growth, the diamond represents clarity, the star represents aspiration, the circle represents completeness, the square represents foundation, the cross represents connection, and the dot represents essence. Jake Morrison felt he had to say something before his team lost their composure entirely. Professor, these rules are very clear. We appreciate the cultural significance of the symbols as well. Excellent, Zixthara replied. I must tell you that these matrices represent the finest intellectual challenge our civilization has produced. The greatest Vorthan minds have devoted their lives to understanding the principles required to solve them. The alien observers from other species watched with growing interest. The Morphians had moved closer to the barriers, their tentacles writhing with anticipation. The ethereals had condensed their gaseous forms into tighter shapes, focusing their attention on the humans. In our culture, the professor continued, the ability to solve even one great logic matrix is considered a mark of exceptional intelligence. Those who can solve multiple matrices are revered as intellectual giants. The few who have solved 8 or more are remembered in our history as the greatest thinkers of their generations. Dr. Helen Brooks exchanged another look with Pete Johnson. Both of them were now red in the face from the effort of not laughing out loud. The situation was becoming more incredible by the moment. We understand the importance of this challenge, Jake said carefully. Our entire species' future relationship with the consortium depends on our performance here. Indeed it does, Professor. Zixthara agreed. I hope you appreciate that I have chosen our most difficult puzzles for this evaluation. I wanted to ensure that if humans succeed, there can be no question about your intellectual capabilities. Lisa Carter managed to find her voice. Professor, before we begin, may we have a few minutes to discuss our approach as a team? Of course, the crystal being replied graciously. Take all the time you need to prepare. This is, after all, the most important test your species will ever face. The humans gathered in a tight circle in the center of the chamber. Their alien observers watched with keen interest, unable to hear the whispered conversation that followed. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Helen asked quietly. If you're seeing what I think you're seeing, then yes, Pete replied, his voice shaking with barely controlled mirth. This is incredible, Lisa whispered. I mean, literally incredible. How is this possible? Jake looked around at his team. Someone explain what's happening here. Helen took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Commander, what Professor Zixthara calls the Great Logic Matrix, what the Vorthans consider their ultimate intellectual challenge, what has stumped their greatest minds for 3,000 years. She paused, struggling with the enormity of what she was about to say. What is it? Jake pressed. Helen looked him straight in the eye. It's Sudoku, sir. They've invented Sudoku and they think it's impossible. The silence that followed Helen's whispered revelation was deafening. Jake Morrison stared at his mathematician, trying to process what she had just told him. Around their small circle, the other 10 humans looked at each other with expressions that ranged from disbelief to barely controlled hysteria. "You're absolutely certain?" Jake asked quietly. Pete Johnson nodded, pulling out his tablet and shielding it from the alien observers. "Look, sir, same rules, same structure, same logic. The only difference is they're using their cultural symbols instead of numbers 1 through 9. On Pete's screen was a familiar sight to every human in the chamber, a Sudoku puzzle from a popular mobile game. The 9x9 grid with its 3x3 subdivisions was identical to what Professor Zixthara had called the Great Logic Matrix. Lisa Carter leaned in closer. "I've got the premium version of this app on my phone. It generates unlimited puzzles at different difficulty levels. What they showed us would probably rate as intermediate, maybe advanced." "How many of these have you solved?" Jake asked her. Lisa shrugged. "Thousands, probably. I do them on my commute every day. Takes me about 10 to 15 minutes for a standard puzzle." Helen Brooks was already sketching on her notepad, converting the Vorthan symbols into numbers for easier solving. "Commander, I teach these puzzles to my undergraduate students as logic exercises. They're popular in retirement homes, children's activity books, newspaper puzzle sections. My 8-year-old nephew can solve the easy ones." Jake felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief washing over him. The alien species that had been testing humanity's intelligence for months, the advanced civilizations that traveled between stars and built massive space stations, had somehow failed to recognize that their ultimate intellectual challenge was a common human recreational activity. "All right," he said, making a decision. "We need to handle this carefully. We can't let them know we're treating their greatest achievement as a simple game, but we also need to show them what humans are capable of." The team spent the next few minutes organizing their approach. They would work on the puzzles systematically, with each person taking responsibility for one or more matrices. They would solve them at a reasonable pace, not so fast as to seem disrespectful, but efficiently enough to demonstrate human capability. When they broke their huddle, Professor Zixthara was waiting expectantly. The crystal being's form had shifted to a patient blue color, clearly prepared for a long wait while the humans struggled with the impossible puzzles. "We're ready to begin," Jake announced. "Excellent," the professor replied. "Remember, you have 4 hours. Do not feel discouraged. If you cannot complete many puzzles, even attempting them seriously will provide valuable data about human cognitive processes." Helen Brooks approached the first matrix display. She had already worked out the solution in her head during their team discussion, but she made a show of studying the puzzle carefully. The alien observers leaned forward with interest as she picked up the light pen used to mark the display. "Let me see," she said aloud, as if thinking through the problem. "This row needs the spiral symbol, and this column already has spirals here and here, so the spiral must go in this position." She marked the empty space with confidence. The watching aliens stirred with surprise at her quick decision. "Now, that means this 3x3 section needs its spiral somewhere else," Helen continued, moving her pen to another part of the grid. "Since this column and this row already have spirals, it has to go here." Pete Johnson had moved to the second matrix and was working with similar efficiency. "This corner section is missing the triangle, star, and dot," he said, apparently reasoning. Out loud, "The triangle can't go here because this row already has one, so it must be here or here." The Morphian's tentacles were moving in rapid, agitated patterns. The ethereals had compressed their gaseous forms even further, focusing intently on the human activity. Lisa Carter joined Helen at the first matrix. "Don't forget this column needs the cross," she said helpfully. "And looking at this section, the cross can only fit in 2 possible spaces." "You're right," Helen replied, filling in another symbol. "That means the diamond goes here, which puts the circle here." Jake watched his team work with growing amazement. What the Vorthans had described as puzzles that could take lifetimes to solve were being completed with casual conversation and mutual assistance. The humans were not just solving the matrices, they were doing it while chatting with each other as if they were passing time during a coffee break. "This one's almost finished," Pete announced. filling in the final row of his matrix. Just need the dot here and the square there. Professor Zixthara's crystal form had gone completely transparent, a color Jake had never seen before. The alien was clearly in shock. "Wait," one of the other humans called out. "Pete, I think you made an error. Check that middle section again." Pete looked back at his completed puzzle, scanning it quickly. "You're right, thanks. I put 2 crescents in the same 3x3 square." He erased one symbol and corrected it. "There we go." "Easy mistake to make," Helen said sympathetically, still working on her own puzzle. "I do that sometimes when I'm rushing." The casual way the humans discussed their mistakes and corrections seemed to disturb the alien observers even more than their rapid solving speed. This was clearly not how the Vorthans approached their great logic matrices. Within 30 minutes, 4 puzzles were complete. The humans were working faster now, their initial caution about appearing disrespectful overcome by the simple pleasure of solving familiar puzzles. They had begun to treat the challenge exactly as they would treat any other Sudoku session, as a relaxing mental exercise. "This one has an interesting pattern," Lisa observed, working on the 7th matrix. The designer placed the initial symbols to create a kind of symmetry. "Oh, that's nice," Helen agreed, glancing over. "Very elegant starting position. Should we work on the hard ones now?" Pete asked, having finished his 3rd puzzle. Jake Morrison realized that his team was no longer thinking about impressing aliens or representing humanity. They were simply enjoying themselves, solving puzzles they found genuinely entertaining. The fate of Earth's membership in the Galactic Consortium had become secondary to the satisfaction of completing a good Sudoku. "I think we can finish all 12, Helen said confidently. "These are well-designed puzzles. Whoever created them has a good understanding of logical flow and difficulty scaling." Professor Zixthara made a sound like breaking glass. The crystal being was staring at the completed matrices with what Jake could only describe as existential horror. By the 1-hour mark, 10 puzzles were finished. The humans were now openly enjoying themselves, offering each other tips and pointing out interesting symbol patterns. They had completely forgotten that they were supposed to be struggling with impossible challenges. The alien observers had fallen into stunned silence, watching their assumptions about human intelligence crumble. With each completed matrix, Professor Zixthara stood frozen in the center of the chamber, its crystalline form cycling through colors that Jake Morrison had never seen before. The alien's body flickered between deep purple, transparent white, and a sickly yellow-green that seemed to indicate complete bewilderment. Around the observation areas, representatives from a dozen different species watched in stunned silence as the humans finished their 11th puzzle. "Just one more," Dr. Helen Brooks announced cheerfully, moving to the final matrix display. "This one looks like it might be a bit trickier. See how they placed the starting symbols? Very clever design." Pete Johnson peered over her shoulder. "Oh, that is nice." The symmetric placement creates some interesting constraints in the middle sections. "Should take about 15 minutes, Lisa Carter estimated, glancing at the puzzle. "Maybe 20 if there are some tricky deductions in the corners." The casual confidence in their voices seemed to physically pain Professor Zixthara. The crystal being made another sound like breaking glass, louder this time, and its form shifted to a color so dark it was almost black. Jake realized that he could not let this continue without some explanation. His team was innocently destroying 3,000 years of Vorthan intellectual pride, and they did not even realize it. The aliens deserved to understand what was happening, even if the truth was going to be difficult for them to accept. "Professor," Jake said gently, "I think we need to have a conversation." Zixthara's form flickered again, settling into a dull gray that Jake interpreted as depression or defeat. "I do not understand what I am witnessing," the professor said, its voice barely above a whisper. "This should not be possible." The other alien observers had begun moving closer to the barriers, their various forms of communication creating a low buzz of confusion and concern throughout the chamber. The Morphean's tentacles writhed in agitated patterns. The ethereals had lost their careful shapes and were swirling like storm clouds. In 3,000 years of Vorthan civilization, Professor Zixthara continued, no individual has solved more than 8 great logic matrices in their entire lifetime. The greatest minds of our species have devoted decades to understanding the principles required for even basic competency. Yet your people treat these puzzles as if they were simple exercises. Helen Brooks looked up from the final matrix, which she was already halfway through solving. Professor, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. What kind of misunderstanding? Zixthara asked, its form brightening slightly with hope. Jake Morrison took a deep breath. He had handled many difficult diplomatic situations during his career, but nothing quite like this. How did you tell an advanced alien civilization that their greatest intellectual achievement was a popular human children's game? Professor, what you call the Great Logic Matrix, Jake began carefully, we call by a different name. On Earth, we know this type of puzzle as Sudoku. The crystal beings form when completely still. Sudoku? Yes, Helen added, trying to be helpful. It's a logic puzzle that became very popular on our world about 50 years ago. The name comes from an old Earth language. It means single numbers in Japanese. Professor Zixthara's color shifted to the sickly yellow-green again. You have a name for it? These puzzles exist on your world? Pete Johnson nodded, pulling out his tablet again. Professor, would you like to see? Without waiting for permission, Pete activated his device and held it up so the alien could see the screen. The display showed a simple interface for a Sudoku application, with options for different difficulty levels and millions of available puzzles. This is just one app, Pete explained. There are hundreds of similar programs available for our devices. This particular one has been downloaded over 50 million times. The crystal being stared at the screen as if it were showing something impossible. 50 million? Oh, that's not even the most popular one, Lisa Carter said, pulling out her own device. This app has over 200 million downloads. It generates new puzzles automatically and tracks your solving times. My personal best for a difficult puzzle is 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Professor Zixthara made a sound like an entire crystal chandelier falling down a flight of stairs. The noise was so distressing that several of the other alien observers backed away from their viewing positions. 4 minutes, the professor repeated weakly. Well, that was a really good day, Lisa admitted modestly. Usually I take about 7 or 8 minutes for the hard ones. The easy puzzles only take me 2 or 3 minutes. Helen Brooks had finished the final matrix while they were talking. All done, she announced. That last one was fun. I liked the way the symbol placement forced you to think about the interactions between the different 3x3 sections. Jake looked around the chamber. 12 completed great logic matrices glowed on their displays. His team had solved in 90 minutes what Professor Zixthara claimed had challenged the greatest Vorthan minds for millennia. And they had done it while chatting casually about puzzle design and sharing solving tips. Professor, Jake said gently, I think we need to explain something important. These puzzles, Sudoku, are very common on Earth. You can find them in our daily newspapers, in books sold at grocery stores, in magazines for children. Many humans solve several of them every day, just for entertainment. Entertainment, Zixthara whispered. My grandmother does them while she watches television, Pete added. She's solved thousands over the years. Keeps her mind sharp, she says. Thousands, the professor repeated, its form now flickering rapidly between colors. Dr. Lisa Carter tried to offer some comfort. Professor, this doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your people's intelligence. Every species develops different mental exercises. I'm sure there are Vorthan puzzles that would challenge us. But her words seemed to make things worse. Professor Zixthara's form went completely dark, darker than Jake had ever seen it. You do not understand, the alien said, its voice filled with something that sounded like despair. The Great Logic Matrix is not just one of our puzzles. It is the puzzle. It represents the pinnacle of Vorthan intellectual achievement. Our greatest philosophers have written entire books analyzing the principles required to solve even one matrix. We have universities dedicated to studying the logical frameworks involved. Entire careers have been built on advancing our understanding of these puzzles by tiny increments. The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of the stations. Systems. Jake began to grasp the true magnitude of what had just happened. This was not simply a case of humans being good at alien puzzles. This was the complete collapse of a civilization's fundamental assumptions about intelligence and logic. Our children, Helen said quietly, learn to solve these in elementary school. We use them to teach basic logical reasoning. Professor Zixtaras' crystal form began to dim, growing darker and more transparent at the same time. The alien was clearly experiencing some kind of existential crisis. Jake Morrison realized that humanity's relationship with the Galactic Consortium was about to change in ways that no one had anticipated. The silence in the chamber stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Professor Zixtara remained motionless, its crystal form so dark and dim that it looked like a shadow of its former self. The alien observers from other species watched nervously, clearly unsure how to react to what they had witnessed. Commander Jake Morrison knew that he was facing a critical moment, not just for humanity's membership in the Galactic Consortium, but for the relationships between all the species present. What had started as a simple test had become something much more significant, a fundamental challenge to how these advanced civilizations viewed intelligence itself. Dr. Helen Brooks seemed to sense the gravity of the situation as well. She approached Professor Zixtara slowly, her voice gentle and respectful. Professor, I want you to know that we don't think less of your people because of this. Intelligence isn't about being better or worse at specific things. It's about thinking in different ways. The crystal being's form flickered slightly, showing the first sign of response since the revelation about Sudoku. How can you say that? Zixtara asked, its voice hollow. Your species treats our greatest intellectual achievement as a simple game for children. Pete Johnson stepped forward, his engineering background helping him find practical words. Professor, let me ask you something. Could you design and build a faster-than-light drive system? Of course, Zixtara replied automatically. All Vorthan. Engineers learn the principles of quantum space folding. Well, most humans can't do that, Pete said with a smile. Your people have mastered technologies that we're still trying to understand. You've built incredible space stations like this. 1. You've created communication systems that work across vast distances. Those things require intelligence that we're still developing. Dr. Lisa Carter joined the conversation. Every species has different strengths, Professor. You mentioned that these symbols have deep cultural meaning for your people. The way you think about logic might be completely different from how we approach it. That doesn't make either approach wrong. Professor Zixtara's form began to brighten slightly, shifting from the deep black toward a lighter gray. But how is it possible that something so complex for us is so simple for you? Jake Morrison had been thinking about this question since. The revelation began. Professor, may I suggest something? Perhaps the complexity isn't in the puzzle itself, but in how different minds approach it. Your people might be overthinking the problem. Overthinking? Zixtara asked, its color shifting to a curious green. Helen Brooks nodded enthusiastically. Yes, exactly. Sudoku puzzles work best when you don't try to find deep meaning or complex patterns. You just follow the simple rules step by step. Look for the obvious moves first, then work through the logical implications. She gestured toward one of the completed matrices. When I solve these, I'm not thinking about philosophy or grand logical frameworks. I'm just asking myself simple questions. Where can this symbol go? What symbols are missing from this section? It's almost mechanical once you learn the basic techniques. The crystal being moved closer to the display, studying the completed puzzle with new eyes. You do not contemplate the deeper implications of each symbol placement? Not really, Pete admitted. I mean, the puzzles are satisfying to solve, but they're more like mental exercise than profound contemplation. It's relaxing, actually. Professor Zixtara's form shifted through several colors rapidly, confusion, understanding, embarrassment, and finally something that looked like rueful acceptance. I believe I am beginning to understand. We have been approaching these puzzles as if they were sacred texts requiring deep interpretation, when they are actually mechanical processes requiring systematic application of simple rules. That's a very good way to put it. Jake agreed. One of the Morphean observers pressed against the barrier, its tentacles forming complex patterns that Lisa's translation device interpreted as rapid, excited communication. The Morphean delegate is asking if humans have other games that might be considered advanced puzzles by their species, Lisa reported. Jake looked at his team. They were all grinning now, the diplomatic tension replaced by genuine curiosity about what other surprises might emerge from this cultural exchange. Well, Pete said thoughtfully, there's chess, checkers, poker, bridge, crossword puzzles, word searches, jigsaw puzzles, riddles, brain teasers. He paused, realizing the list could go on for quite a while. Professor Zixthara's crystal form was now cycling through colors rapidly. What Jake had learned indicated intense excitement. You have many such games? Thousands, Helen replied. Humans create new puzzles and games constantly. It's one of our favorite forms of entertainment. Entertainment, the professor repeated, but this time the word didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like a revelation. Jake Morrison saw an opportunity to turn this potentially embarrassing situation into something positive. Professor, what if we proposed an exchange program? Your people could learn about human games and puzzles, and we could learn about Vorthan approaches to logic and problem solving. Maybe we could all benefit from understanding how different minds work. The crystal being's form brightened considerably. That is actually a fascinating proposition. If your people can solve our greatest puzzles so easily, perhaps, you could teach us new ways of thinking about logical problems. And maybe your people could teach us about the deeper cultural and philosophical meanings behind the symbols, Lisa added. Just because we can solve the puzzles quickly doesn't mean we understand their significance to your civilization. Professor. Zixthara was now glowing with what Jake recognized as genuine enthusiasm. Yes, I can see great potential for mutual learning. Perhaps intelligence is not about being superior or inferior, but about having different perspectives on the same problems. The alien observers throughout the chamber began communicating among themselves with increased energy. The initial shock of watching humans effortlessly solve impossible puzzles was being replaced by curiosity about what other human activities might challenge their own assumptions. Jake pulled out a deck of cards from his jacket pocket, something he always carried for relaxation during long space journeys. Professor, if you found Sudoku interesting, wait until you see poker. Professor. Zixthara's crystal form went completely transparent with curiosity. Poker? It's a game that combines mathematical probability, psychological analysis, strategic thinking, and risk assessment, Jake explained. Players receive cards randomly, but the skill comes from reading other players' behavior and making calculated decisions with incomplete information. The professor's form began cycling through colors again. Incomplete information? Psychological analysis? This sounds far more complex than our logic matrices, Pete Johnson chuckled. Oh, Professor, you have no idea. Wait until we teach you about bluffing. As Jake Morrison looked around the chamber at the excited alien observers and his grinning teammates, he realized that humanity's relationship with the Galactic Consortium was about to become far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. They had not just passed a test. They had accidentally revolutionized how an entire group of species thought about intelligence, games, and learning. The test was over, but the real education was just beginning. And for the first time since arriving at Station Nexus, Jake was certain that both humans and aliens were going to benefit enormously from what they learned from each other.